This story is about the reaction of a family member who was solely focused on inheriting the parents' wealth, instead of doing the right thing. Especially on the day the mother announced how she would distribute her late husband's estate. What happened? Let's find out. Before we dive into the story, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel.
Hello. I'm a woman in my 40s, happily married to a kind and hardworking husband for nearly 20 years. We got married when my father-in-law was battling cancer. At that time, I hadn't even considered marriage. But then, my boyfriend at the time, who is now my husband, said, "It seems like my father will pass away soon. I want him to see his youngest son get married. If you're not thinking about marriage, I'll understand if we break up." This shocked me. After giving it some thought, I realized I did see a future with him. So we decided to get married quickly, much like roasting beans on lightning. Both families respected our decision, and we became husband and wife without any major issues. Sadly, not long after, my father-in-law passed away. He owned a small business, nothing big, just a factory with one production line. He was a small business owner who managed to survive the tough AIMF crisis and left his company to his sons as their inheritance. Naturally, it was expected that the mother would take care of dividing this inheritance between her two sons. My brother-in-law and my husband initially worked in fields completely unrelated to their father's business, but eventually jumped into managing the company. This meant a lot of early struggles to adapt to the business right after our marriage. To add to the stress, we didn't have children. For the first 7 years of our marriage, I wanted to live with my mother-in-law, especially since she was grieving and struggling with depression. However, she refused, insisting that living with her youngest son would embarrass her eldest. Back then, I thought it was just an old-fashioned view, believing that if siblings took care of their parents instead of the eldest, it would look bad in the eyes of relatives. Respecting her wishes, I tried my best to look after her by visiting frequently. As the business began to stabilize, both my brother-in-law and my husband found more free time. However, my brother-in-law, now acting as the president of the company, often left the hard work to my diligent husband, which bothered me. My husband, though, believed it wasn't worth fussing over sibling issues. I didn't want to argue, considering he was a good provider who didn't indulge in drinking, smoking, or other vices. Around the time we were expecting our first child, my brother-in-law got married. Frankly, he was neither particularly handsome nor had a pleasant personality, so I assumed he'd remain single. He had been set up on several blind dates, but they never went well, often ending without even a chance for a follow-up meeting. However, once he started making a decent amount of money, he brought home a young lady. She was 10 years younger than him and 6 years younger than us. At first, we were a bit surprised, but seeing how happy my mother-in-law was, we didn't say anything. Although my husband and I didn't bring it up, there was a sense of unease. We wondered how well the two of them would get along. But they ended up getting married. Later, we had our first child, which was at a rather late age for us. I was so busy recovering and taking care of the baby that I couldn't check in on my mother-in-law as much as before. One day, I received a call from my older sister-in-law, which was surprising since we didn't usually talk. She casually mentioned, "You seem to have lost all interest in your mother-in-law. I hear you're always at your parents' house." It was absurd because she was calling while my parents were helping me with postpartum care and childcare. So, I responded as nicely as I could, "I'm still in the middle of my recovery. That's why they're here. What's up?" Then, my sister-in-law said, "Your mother-in-law's fridge is empty. If it stays like this, what is the elderly lady supposed to eat?" My mother-in-law had lived her whole life as a homemaker. Whenever I had something nice to eat, I wanted to share it with her, not because she couldn't fend for herself. Hearing this while I was still not fully recovered, and taking care of a newborn was frustrating. So I said, "Then perhaps you could start bringing her food yourself. I'd appreciate it if you could help out until our child is a bit older." She accused me of being disrespectful to my elders and hung up. To be honest, it felt unfair that I had to use formal and respectful language towards my sister-in-law who is 6 years younger, just because she married my brother-in-law. I believe in maintaining a certain level of respect towards each other. But she was the one who broke that first. When I first mentioned it to my husband, he asked me to just endure it a bit longer. He said, "You know how my brother and his wife can be. I'm sorry. Just bear with it for me." So, I didn't push the issue further, believing that my husband wasn't at fault. However, as time went on, things got worse. During family gatherings on holidays, they made my husband and me out to be the worst kind of unfilial children. All the side dishes and gifts I had brought were credited to my sister-in-law, while my husband and I were painted as the greedy couple, only concerned with our high-paying jobs. I thought I would stand up for myself and get angry when faced with such situations. But when no one directly confronted us and everyone treated us coldly, we didn't even get a chance to explain ourselves. Eventually, I started to feel as powerless as my husband, thinking that if we just did our part quietly, someone would recognize our efforts. But that wasn't the case. My brother-in-law started bragging about how he would inherit everything left by my father-in-law, including the house my mother-in-law lived in and the insurance money. This subtly affected my husband's standing at his company too. My husband, until then, believed that ignoring the falsehoods would be enough. The problem exploded due to my brother-in-law's pretense. It turned out he had taken out a loan using the company's property as collateral when he got married without telling my husband, and only paying the interest when it was time to pay the principal. The situation became dire, with equipment and property being at risk of auction due to the significant amount of debt. Eventually, both my mother-in-law and sister-in-law became aware of the situation. We gathered to discuss the matter, but found ourselves at a dead end. The money borrowed had been spent on my brother-in-law's house and car purchases. The consensus was that selling everything and repaying the debt was the best move. But my sister-in-law strongly opposed. She felt deceived, having married into the family under the impression that they had a house and cars. There was a lot of shouting, crying, and threats of lawsuits from her end at my in-laws. Finally, out of desperation, my mother-in-law suggested selling her own house to cover the debts. Then, my sister-in-law said, "So, are you saying you want to move in with us?" I absolutely cannot do that. And my brother-in-law added, "Yeah, Mom. We're newlyweds. We can't take care of you." How could they say such things when their debt was threatening to bring down the company? It must have been hard for my mother-in-law to even suggest selling her home. But faced with their response, she was visibly shocked. Eventually, she retreated to her bedroom, locking the door behind her and not coming out. The situation remained unresolved, becoming increasingly desperate as an auction seemed imminent. My husband and I decided to sell our house and use our savings to cover the debts and revive the company. It was a daunting decision for both of us. Yet, believing in our youth and ability to overcome anything, we quickly proceeded with our plan. We moved in with my mother-in-law, starting our lives anew under her roof. My mother-in-law graciously offered our family her house, not without expressing her embarrassment towards us. She also let us use the master bedroom and took full care of our first child during the day, making our lives much easier than before. My brother-in-law and his wife, however, were shamelessly audacious despite causing the trouble themselves. They would suddenly show up at the house demanding, "So, how are we dividing the remaining assets? Since it's come to this, give us our share in advance." It's true that my mother-in-law had always doted on my brother-in-law, especially after a severe illness in his childhood that nearly took his life, making him the proverbial sore thumb even as an adult. But, following this debacle, it seemed, even she found it difficult to continue her unwavering support. One day, my mother-in-law called both our families to discuss something. She revealed that my father-in-law's estate wasn't much, essentially just the company and the house we were living in. She stated, "With what the eldest took, it's if half of your father's estate is gone, maybe even more. So there's nothing left to give you." This was news to us, and undoubtedly a shock to my brother-in-law and his wife as well. My brother-in-law stood up abruptly, exclaiming, "Mom, how can you do this to me? Are you saying I should just accept this and go away?" Meanwhile, his wife suddenly clung to my mother-in-law, asking, "Mom, are you very angry? Why are you doing this?" while attempting to charm her in a distasteful display of affection. My husband and I were simply stunned, listening to what was being said. The conclusion was that there would be no inheritance left for my brother-in-law's family, and my mother-in-law decided she would live with us. She mentioned that she might consider condition that we would provide her with living expenses or an allowance, as per my father-in-law's will. From that point on, all legal processes were completed, and my husband took over the entirety of the company's shares. Contrary to our expectations of always covering for his brother, my husband became indifferent towards him, especially after our mother had given up on him. He even went as far as to eliminate my brother-in-law's nominal position at the company and proceeded with his dismissal. After a long absence, my brother-in-law came to the company only to find his position gone, which led him to create a scene once again. He showed up at our house and even screamed at the company, attempting to throw a punch at my husband. Eventually, the situation was concluded after he was reported to the police and taken away. Having lorded over the company like a boss for over a decade, it's hard to imagine what he could do now. I heard he became unemployed, gradually selling his car and taking out a mortgage on his house to squander his money. It seemed inevitable that once he ran through his funds, he would cling to our mother or us for support. About 3 years had passed when, predictably, he showed up at our house, looking drastically worn and thin. Deciding to hear what he had to say, I opened the door, only to find him kneeling at the entrance. "Mom, I've really messed up. Please give me another chance. I'm so deep in debt that I'm facing lawsuits and even prison time," he pleaded. So what happened to him? He's currently filed for personal bankruptcy and has rejoined my husband's company, working on the production line, just like any other entry-level employee, receiving the same salary and schedule. Being in the process of rehabilitation, he's legally required to pay all his earnings, above a certain minimum living expense, to the court. He's managing to live in a tiny apartment with his wife on just about $1,100 a month. It seems his wife has decided to stick with him, perhaps thinking there's no better option now that they're both financially destitute. Is it a silver lining? Maybe. I thought my mother-in-law might soften towards him, but she's been surprisingly firm. While she adores our daughter and supports us unconditionally, she's made it clear she wants nothing to do with my brother-in-law and his family, even telling them not to come over for holidays or celebrations. My married life started off as complicated as a tangled mess, but now it feels refreshingly straightforward.
It's truly refreshing. Your mother-in-law's decisiveness is remarkable. Good people often suffer because of their soft-heartedness, but you and your husband, both kind and strong-willed, are truly admirable.